Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest RTS Lunchtime event. Today, we're going to discuss how the industry is moving back into production during this phase of the pandemic, what the longer-term impact might be, and what we can learn from those who are actually on the ground making shows. My name is Alex Farber, and I'm Deputy Editor of Broadcast Magazine. Just promoting myself there, sorry, Chris. Before I introduce our panel, a housekeeping point. The first 40 to 45 minutes of our hour-long session will be moderated by myself before opening up to questions from you guys. If any of you have questions, please do submit them via the question button, and I'll put as many of these to our panelists as possible towards the end of the event. Right, now to introduce our panelists. So, to begin with, we have John McVeigh, who is Chief Executive of PACT. He contributes to many UK government and international policy forums on the creative industries, and has extensive experience of policy development across all aspects of broadcasting and TV production. We have Claire Pisey. She is executive producer of Top Gear, waving there, and a hugely experienced producer who for the past 4 years has been at the helm of the motoring format, which has recently been promoted to BBC One. She's had an eventful return to filming since she began on Friday, and I'm sure we'll come back to reference that. Next, we have Susan King, Director of Production from Remarkable. Sue is currently working across the Endemol Shine Group Indies extensive output, which includes Sunday Brunch, Your Home Made Perfect, House of Games, and The Wall. And last but not least, John Weston. John's Managing Director of Continuing Drama and Head of ITV in the North. And he has overseen and nurtured some of ITV's most popular dramas, including Fat Friends, Poirot, Marple, Cracker, but his latest challenge has been to get Emmerdale and Coronation Street back up and running. So, to begin with, I was going to turn to John McVeigh. John has worked closely with the broadcasters to pull together a comprehensive set of guidelines which have been drawn up to enable producers to get back making programming. John, can you talk us through a little bit about that process and how flexible those guidelines are in real terms?
Well, the guidelines have been approved by the government as part of the conditions of getting back to work. All sectors have to have safe working practices approved by Health and Safety England, Scotland, the nations, but also Public Health England as well. And we worked with all the major broadcasters. It was originally led by John's good friends at ITV, to try and look at what could be done to get particularly the soaps up and running and some of the larger shows. And of course, government was broadly sympathetic to that, given that they could see that bringing in new content that maybe reflected the experience of the pandemic and changes in our society going forward would be a good thing. So I would say that government was sympathetic at the political level, but clearly you still have to satisfy Health and Safety Executive, Public Health England, and now they've also brought in consultants Ernst & Young to make sure that each sector is broadly doing cross-cutting compliance with the health and safety guidance that's issued. So the broadcaster guidance is that, it's broadcaster guidance, and it complies with the government's current instructions on social distancing, safe working, PPE, whatever you need to do in order to create a safe working environment. So in one respect, it's just like any other health and safety risk assessment you have to do for production per production. But of course, in this context, it's very attuned and aligned to the needs of the pandemic and issues about transmission and infection. So each is very high level guidance. There is other guidance for drama that was developed by the British Film Commission, but that's specifically targeted at effectively closed set, high-end features and TV drama. So it's more prescriptive in terms of what you do in makeup and what you do in other departments. So the broadcaster guidance, I'm glad, is high level, that it's up to each production to work out how they comply with that. And clearly your broadcaster will look for you to develop your health and safety requirements, your risk assessments, your mitigations. If you are doing certain things where people have to be in closer proximity, what are you doing to mitigate for that? And ultimately, if there was an issue, you would be investigated by the Health and Safety Executive if there was a problem. Now, of course, this is only version 1 of the guidance, and it's given the past few weeks with the sort of confusion about what we can and can't do and who we can and can't do it with, and certainly amongst the general public, this guidance will change and it will be updated as health and safety looks to relax certain areas. But I think it was a good early and first move. We were one of the first sectors to actually get this guidance done. And I think that was a good thing, good for our industry, but a good message to the government that we're keen to get back to work and we can do it in a safe and responsible way.
Yeah. And I think they've certainly helped our producers, our production industry in terms of being able to do that. You referenced the soaps as them helping. Let's turn to the other John Weston. John, you re-entered production last month after a brief hiatus and having to drop down the number of episodes. What measures have you had to take to ensure that your cast and your crew are observing these guidelines and in such what is a high-pressured environment? Deadlines are looming constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got 4 kind of main watchwords. Keep your distance, so we're observing the 2-meter rule at all times. We've got people wielding sticks that are 2 meters long, which somebody's actually even got a telescopic 2-meter stick that he whips out at times. And you know, obviously we've given them to the kind of people who've always wanted to wield a stick. They're now really enjoying it, and they're doing it with real gusto. So keep your distance. So all the buildings are marked out. All that kind of stuff is here. So everyone, but on sets particularly, the actors are keeping 2 meters from each other, and we're having to use different camera angles to sort of make that seem not quite as it is. I think the actors are finding it interesting because they're sort of projecting more, like as if they're in some West End theatrical production. We're having to pull them down because they're projecting to the thing, but it's not coming over that way. Or it's looking much more natural on camera, so we're pulling them down a bit. The second thing is keep in groups. So we've cohorted all our studios. So in the past, a filming unit would move and they do some shots in that studio, then they move out onto the lot, and they move back into that studio. We've changed all that. So for the time being, 1 filming unit stays in a couple of studios. They don't go anywhere but those studios. They don't go into any social spaces but those social spaces. Another set operates in on a lot, another studio. So the only people who move around are the actors, and the actors move around into their own safe space, which is basically their set. So we have kind of crime tape up, and no one can go into the actor's set. So in the past, we'd have had cameras in there, but we've got to do everything with Zooms and things. So those cohorts mean that everybody sticks to their own bits of equipment. They sanitize it, but it just means that they've labeled it. That's my camera, that's my light, that's my bit of wire. So everybody knows exactly where they are. That's the second thing. The third thing is keep it simple. We've gone through all our scripts, and we've kind of probably come down from 21 scenes per episode down to about 16 or 17. We made the scenes slightly longer, but not as complex. We've taken out more actors, especially in our domestic sets, which are quite small, where it's hard to get more than 2 or 3 people in there. But we simplified things down. For example, we don't have any children at the moment, and the reason for that, we could have them. You know, they'd give us licenses, but children come with tutors and chaperones and people that you know would have to have a position on the studio floor, and we're just trying to keep that right down. And then the final thing is keep away, which I think is one of the hardest things, because everybody just wants to come into the office. I mean, I'm in the office now, and I've used you as an excuse for coming in, just for the social interaction. But we're having to say to everybody who isn't filming, just stay away, stay away. So we've got teams all working from home, which I worry about, because I think it does become, 3 months of it was pretty awful for all of us. But they're doing it, and we'll look at bringing in small teams from time to time just to get the contact up. But it means that our crews themselves are much sort of more reduced. And given that, the thing in life is always to find an assistant who can do your job for you very well. That's the aim in life. It's difficult for our crews because you've got very, very experienced cameramen who are used to having camera assistants around, and everybody wants their assistant in, but we can't, because we can't fit that even in large studios.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to staffing and the implications of that maybe towards the end, but it is something I wanted to pick up on. What would have I said to you about the extent to which you've had to change the storylines or the direction or the soap or the shape of the soap to be able to, you know, reflect some of these changes? Has there been significant changes to the stories?
Yeah, I mean, when we shut down, we were about to do two really big things that we couldn't have done. One was a sort of massive, very big court case, and which would have required going out on location. And you know, for us, that means kind of many people in buses and trucks, and also just putting the public at risk, but also putting ourselves at risk. So what we have done is basically taken everything into our studio and into our lot. So we will do a court case, but we'll build our own court, you know, and that we have that facility. That's the great thing about having sort of, you know, the Corrie and Emmerdale. You've got carpenter shops where you can just build a courtroom if you need to, which I know isn't open to other people. But again, we were going to do a big car stunt, which we've had to sort of reduce down a bit. But you know, I'm looking at scripts coming up for, we've got our 60th on Corrie, and obviously normally we blow everything up for your 60th or flood things, or you know, and we will be doing something, but it won't be quite on that scale as we work our way back into things. So we've had to reduce some of those things down. I think the biggest effect on the soaps is those sort of events where you normally have half of your cast all, you know, fighting at a wedding or something, and that becomes slightly more difficult. So you know, you'll see more scenes with 3 or 4 people. So it's kind of back, I suppose, to the essence of soap, which is fantastic scripts and really good performances.
And how happy are you with, in terms of what's been being produced so far? If you're normally, you know, 100% happy, you know, have those changes have you had to reduce your expectations in terms of what's possible for the viewer? Have you found that challenging?
Yeah. I'm 100% happy that we're still on air, I think, and that everyone's still got jobs and that we're still going. I think that's what makes me happiest. You know, you quite often the things that you take out in your viewings are the bits around the edges. You know, in other words, that very loving shot that the director has taken ages to set up and comes off something and then finds and then the actor talks. That's gone anyway. So, you know, I like a little bit of that in the shows, but not too much. So I think for soap, it's not as, you know, it's not as germane perhaps as for very, very high-end drama where, you know, you're relying on that to bring your atmosphere. What we rely on is, you know, people having a go at each other, you know, whether that's in a nice way or a nasty way. And you know, the performances for the actors, for me, are the things that mean that these are, you know, they're totally proper classic Coronation Street and Emmerdale episodes for me.
There has been some changes you've had to make there regards their interaction with each other, hasn't they, in terms of sanitation and hygiene and making sure that props that are handled are properly cleansed in between. You've had to do some work around that.
Yeah, we've gone paperless, so there are no scripts lying around. But you know, if somebody puts something down, if somebody's handing something to somebody, they have to put it down on the table, and we stop tape and come, you know, another sanitized version goes in and they pick it up. So it's kind of things a little bit like that. But I think the biggest issue is when, you know, sex is always a big issue, isn't it? But when we're sort of implying that people are getting up to no good, a lot has to be done with smouldering eyes rather than with clutches. And of course, annoyingly, you know, a lot of our, not a lot, 1 or 2 people on our casts do actually go out with each other or are married to each other. But unfortunately, they're not the same people as are married or go out in the storyline. And I think if we were to write for that, it would be all sorts of odd people would start sort of, you know, cracking up with that.
But you might have some more storylines that you could work towards there. Claire, I'll turn to you now, if I may. John mentioned car stunts and the fact that he's had to row back from them. Now, I can imagine that would be a challenge on a show like Top Gear. Can you give us, well, to be honest, you've had your issues this week, right, with regards to Paddy, and I understand he suffered quite a serious accident. Is everything all right with him, I should ask first and foremost?
You're absolutely fine. It wasn't anything to do with COVID. Can't hide behind that. He was driving at 40 miles an hour and just going over the brow of a hill, and we think there was a bit of grease on the road or oil on the road. And the car there's quite a lot of damage to the car, but obviously we're fully insured, and it was an accident. These things happen when you're filming with cars. You know, he was driving within the speed limit. It was a very controllable situation, and it just happened.
Yeah, so, well, that's some of the risks, and as you said, not COVID related. But to what extent have you had to change your? So, start at the beginning. I understand you'd managed to shoot around half of the VTs ahead of lockdown. Did you have to then, with those remaining, how significantly have your plans had to change?
A lot, because we'd shot one full VT in Cyprus, but we'd started two others, sort of the first half. I mean, the first thing we're dealing with is Paddy's changed his hair colour halfway through the films, but we'll just put a part break in, a studio link. Of course, we can't go abroad. And some of the stuff that we've shot, we did this film in Bolton, and at one point, the three of them are in a car together, and it's weird. You look at the rushes of that now, and it makes you flinch because it looks so. We've all become completely, you know, sort of panicked about that. But I'm glad we've got that for the breadth of the film. So, yes, huge change. We can't go abroad, but I do think what we've got. I mean, I know people say this, but sometimes when you're forced into a constraint, it makes you think in a different way. And I think one of the films that we're doing is a direct result of having to be more creative, because we have to work in a new way. You know,
can you talk us through that so far as you're able without any spoilers?
Well, we want it. We're looking at doing something with a certain type of car where, in order to get round a problem, a social distancing problem, we're looking at, can we put somebody on top of the car as well as inside the car to test this particular car. I mean, we would have never done it if it hadn't been for this. So we kept a core team of development of producers. So 3 producers stayed on, and Al Renton and Nick Dalton and myself. And you know, you're just working with this, and the thing is, we know with Paddy and Freddie and Chris, we know what we're aiming for, and we know the performances we're looking for, because all we do is set up a playground and set them off. But the thing is with Top Gear is that it's not scripted at all anymore, apart from setting up the basic lights. So you never know what's going to happen, and that we have to think what could happen. I mean, even more so than usually, but you know, we work so closely with health and safety. They're on speed dial. They're on most of our shoots with us, because clearly, you know, there is an inherent danger about filming with fast cars. So I would say, COVID itself and the social distancing, you know, A, we're in cars, B, we're always outside. I mean, we'll leave the studio to one side because that will need to be changed. But the actual filming part of it, the show, they're quite often 2 meters apart in any case. But you know, it's all the stuff around it, you know, hotels. How do you know, there's 35 of us on location. How do you stay in a hotel? So we're in a hotel in York at the moment, but if key workers need it, we have to be out of the hotel. That's completely straightforward. You know, how do you travel? You know, you can have bubbles in cars, and somebody in the driver's seat, somebody in the rear passenger seat, or you can have a minibus to get 3 rows as long as they're staggered. You need to think about your camera cards when you're taking them out of when you're taking them out of the cars, and we've got Ziplocs with red and green and everything's signed, and it's all of the stuff around it, not the actual filming, because when you are just completely filming it, that's sort of the same. Okay,
that's encouraging. And you touched on it then, regards the studio section. When those are normally filmed quite close to TX, my sense is, and what's your plans regards whether they're going to be possible and how you might approach that?
Well, I don't think they will be possible. I don't think we can have 700 people in the hangar, but of course it's going to be our first outing on BBC One, so I really don't want just the three presenters 2 meters apart on the runway at Dunsfold. I think that would be a deeply underwhelming start. And I think that Charlotte would want a sense of scale. So we've got a couple of ideas that would get a lot of people there in a socially distant, but sense of scale and event. So we are looking at that. But like every other production, costs are increasing all the way. Edit costs are spiraling. Everything is spiraling. So I've got an idea, but the question is, can we afford it? Really?
Yeah.
Hopeful.
When do you have to make a decision by? What kind of timeline are you working towards on this?
I would probably need to decide it by August.
Okay. And as John, I mean, it's a fast-moving situation, and things may have changed by then, which could result in you being able to do something that may previously have presumed been cost prohibitive.
Yes, but I don't feel that we can. I don't think that we can, because I don't think we can have 700 people in a hangar, and I'm not interested in 300 people in the hangar because it would just look sparsely populated. I think that we have to keep it feeling true to itself. So I don't think that, I can't imagine that will happen. And one of the other problems that we've got is so far when we've been filming, we've been in closed environments. We were filming at Alton Towers last week, which was incredible to get access there, but it was utterly safe. When we've got Paddy, Freddie and Chris out in more of a public arena, at a seaside, we've got something coming up, we're going to have to be very careful about people wanting to come up for selfies, which the guys are great and they love that, but there can be no selfies. All of this, and we don't want to be go away to the public, because one of the things, I think we're more approachable. So that's taking quite a lot of planning about how we're going to make that work. And like John said, we have the 2 meter stick as well, but Paddy put a boxing glove on the end of his. But it's helpful to just remind yourself how very far it is, because I think it can slightly creep in and you can get closer without realizing it. So those sticks are useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you referenced then the fact that your ability to travel has been limited completely, taken away from you. Obviously, some of the most eye-catching, high-profile films are when the guys go abroad to far-flung locations and exotic places. And given the fact that it is your launch on BBC One, to what extent do you feel that it isn't going to be the show that you had hoped it would be, or otherwise?
Now we've worked with them, I am less worried than I would have been if it had been the start. I mean, the incredible locations and the sort of effort and challenging journeys you're putting through, like that we did in Nepal and Peru. Yes, that was fantastic. But I think Top Gear is working now because of the relationship between the three of them. And we've done a film in Bolton that I would argue is the funniest film we've ever made. And I think, we're a British car show, and so I'm less worried. But what I have done is taken the flight money from what were going to be foreign films, and I've added, there's one particular film which I think will be the opening episode, which has got a massive sense of scale, which is dangerous, not just for Fred, but for Paddy and Chris as well. So as long as you don't need to go abroad to get people talking about a show. I feel that quite strongly now, but I still want to go.
Good. Yeah, I definitely, I hear what you're saying. It's a case of boxing clever creatively, boxing clever with your budgets, and coming up with a product that's just as good as the end result. Sue, let's move on to you now, because obviously Claire talked about one of the benefits of Top Gear is the fact that it's filmed outside and there's lots of space and fresh air. You're responsible for Sunday Brunch, which is in many respects a studio show, which is takes place in a very small space. You managed to keep it running under lockdown. How challenging was that, and to what extent did that help you as you moved back into the studio a couple of weeks ago?
Well, it was challenging. I mean, even though we were expecting something to happen, I don't think any of us were really expecting it to hit us as quickly as it did. So yes, we had to react quickly. We have to keep that show on air. You know, it's 3 hours of live television every Sunday morning, 52 weeks of the year. So it was imperative that we worked quickly to make sure we could keep it on air. So we had to, the team had to work very quickly in coming up with a different way of making the programme. So it was all, everyone was in lockdown, everybody was in isolation. So we moved quickly to sending cameras and kits to people's houses and keeping it being pre-recorded with interviews and Tim and Simon still being able to talk to each other, and links to the guests and to the keep the cookery items going. So we were able to react quickly, and I think that worked for a number of weeks, and we did that for about 8 weeks whilst we were working on our plans to get back into the studio as quickly as possible. You know, the main aim for us was to keep production moving and finding the way to build that foundation to keep everybody working and the programmes on air.
And what does it, now you're back in the studio, what does you know, how have the processes changed? What have you been forced to introduce and implement?
So I think what we learned from being on air remotely was what the key elements of the show were that we knew we needed to keep going. The show is very dependent on the chat throughout the morning. We always had guests staying on in the studio across the whole morning, so there were people coming and going. There were always groups of people in the studio, so we couldn't do that, of course. So we've had to reduce the crew, reduce the guests, but still have some people in the studio. Tim and Simon were the first that we knew we had to bring back so that we could have the relationship between the two of them ongoing. And then we've structured it so we have guests coming in individually at the moment, so that we haven't got too many people at once.
Yeah, and I mean, in some respects, I suppose, as the others have said, making the most of the situation and going for guests you wouldn't otherwise have got, perhaps, to video call them.
I think that's a big learning for us, actually, and it's something that I know the team are looking to continue on with. Yes, it's given us access to people that wouldn't normally have been able to come into the studio, and a lot of things have had to be brought to the forefront, and it's brought up some good ideas as well as some challenges, and I think that's definitely one of them.
And something you might consider continuing.
I think so, yes.
You think audiences are happy with video calls as opposed to in studio, or happy, would tolerate?
Yes, I think so. We've all got used to work, doing meetings on Zoom and looking at interviews done via Skype and Zoom. Yes, I think tech is always a bit challenging and a bit, there's always an issue around tech when you're live on air, but overall, I think as part of a live show, I think we can absolutely integrate that in quite well now.
And what about food specifically? Because when I think about food and hygiene around food, I mean, John Weston references having to, get creative with regards passing letters from person to person. When I think about food and tasting and tactile and sharing, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, so we've had to stop everybody crowding around one plate of food and taking a bite from the same plate. Yes, we've made adjustments. But we've reduced the cooks in the studio, but we've introduced and kept the live links to chefs cooking remotely, so we can go to the chefs' kitchens now and keep all of that cooking as a main part of the programme. People absolutely want to see the cooking items, so they haven't gone anywhere. We're just doing them in a different way. And Simon still cooks in the studio. There's a different plate of food given to the guests, so they can still taste it. Simon still passes a plate of food to Tim Lovejoy to taste. I mean, if you look on Instagram, you'll see that between them they've developed the socially distant shuffle, which is the way that Simon is passing the plate of food to Tim. You know, so they're keeping their 2 metre distance, but they're, you know, one edges out and then back in again. It's just a bit of fun, you know, just to make it a normal part of what's probably going to be going on for a little while longer yet. Yeah,
and you've got House of Games due to enter production shortly. Again, I mean, are you in the same studio for these shows? Have you had to make any changes regards to that?
So again, one of the things that, you know, with all of our productions, you address them all. You have to look at them all individually, and there are very, you know, different points to work through on each one. On House of Games, that has always been made in a very small studio. It's essentially Richard Osman and 4 guests sitting on the chairs in the set. But we've had to look at spacing them out so that we're adhering to the 2 metre distance. But what that did, which was probably a surprising outcome, was mean we've got to move to a bigger studio. So we are. But in order
where are you going to?
So we are actually going to be recording the rest of this current series in London, because it's made in Glasgow normally, but combined with travel restrictions and the ability to guarantee we can get cast there safely, and that they're willing to travel. We worked with the BBC closely to have a studio in London. So we're doing that for the rest of this series this summer, because we're also back in studio in a matter of weeks. So we're still very early on in the process of the country opening back up.
And I mean, like, you obviously got The Wall on your slate as well, which was a major success last year. I think it was autumn time it aired. What's your thinking around the extent gearing up for production on that?
Yeah, well,
major BBC One project.
Yes, I mean, it's a very important project for us and the BBC. It did very well. So yes, we're in the planning stages at the moment, looking at the implications on that show. Obviously, that is a show that has an audience, which we're unlikely to be able to do for the next recording period. So we're looking at ways of still keeping the friends and family element in the programme, because that's important to the you know, the
format
and the tension and the support for the contestants. So yes, lots of planning and looking at that and really working out how that's going to go back into the studio.
Yeah, and I suppose, is there a studio move on the cards for that programme?
We're looking at that. We're having, look, we all know that travel anywhere around the country, let alone Europe, is restricted. So we're having to make plans for all eventualities. So yes, at the moment we're looking at not travelling to Europe to make the show. But also, you know, what would that be? We haven't got any definite plans in place just yet. That's all still very much being looked at.
Understood. I mean, it feels like from speaking to all of you, and I don't know, maybe John can address this, but it feels like there's lots and lots of requirements that need doing, and they are going to either require more time or more people. To what extent are costs rising as a result of the changes that have to be made? And is that a significant concern for you guys? John, maybe you can talk, John McVeigh, maybe you can talk to us across the piece on that, and the other guys can jump in terms of their sense of the situation.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
I've got someone's music playlist playing on while I'm on Zoom, which is a new one to me. So it's not my dance tracks, but I've got Dream On Dreamer in the background going on. So I don't know where it's come from. Might be quite good for this panel, Dream On Dreamer. So, well, I mean, there's been a fair bit of work getting done on COVID-related costs, but of course there are mitigations and editorial things, as John, I think, outlined earlier on. But looking across the piece, we're looking at somewhere between a 10 to 30% additional cost to production. Now, of course, some of that can be managed, but clearly on productions, particularly for indies where margins were already pretty slim anyway, trying to soak up those additional costs to get back up to bigger productions is going to be a bit of a challenge. That may change with new health and safety guidance, but that's what the initial analysis is looking like.
And would you guys recognise that? I mean, I don't know, in terms of efficiencies, amount of hours you're able to do in a day, or the costs associated. I mean, who can talk a little bit about what they've been facing and how they've been coping with it regards keeping to budget?
For the soaps, we're probably at the lower end of the 10 to 30%. We're probably down at 10. There's a lot of some medical costs, and actually one thing I would say to everybody who's starting up and thinking of starting up, when we were doing it, which was about 6 weeks ago when we were really starting seriously, the biggest issue was people's fear, I think. I mean, we'd all been sat in our houses watching every night what was going on. And one thing that we did at ITV, once we got the guidelines, which were fantastic, and it was fantastic that Pat worked so diligently on them with all the broadcasters. They are a really good thing to have, because they're something that our staff and everybody can look at and hold us to account on, so they've got something that reassures them. The other bit of reassurance that we did was we had ITV's sort of unofficial doctor, Dr. Paul Litchfield, do Zoom calls with all our crews and all our cast, and just for them to ask him any question that they wanted. I mean, it helped that he had been the Navy's nuclear, biological, chemical warfare doctor for a long time, and had also worked in public health. So, he knows about these germs very intimately. But it just meant that people could ask sometimes very naive questions, sometimes very, very, very intelligent questions that we hadn't really thought about. But as a sort of exercise to get people back into the building and make them feel okay about going there, I think it was really good. And it meant that people, when they did come in, they've been saying that actually work and home are the two safe places in the world at the moment. And that's how we need to really keep it. But in terms of the cost, there's those medical costs, there's screening, we do temperature screening things, sanitizing, all that kind of stuff has been but in a way, quite a one-off cost with some ongoing costs. What we're finding on the filming side is that because we've simplified down, things are taking a little less time, but there again, we're now doing everything sequentially. So the lighting guys go in, come out, the sound guys go in, come out. Whereas before, all that would have happened at the same time. The actors would have been doing their line runs while the camera's getting their shots, while the mic's getting into place. So that has taken more time. So it's kind of been swings and roundabouts. We've gained some from the simplicity of what we're doing, and we've lost some from the kind of from the linear nature of what we're having to do. So yeah.
And in terms of getting back up to full production, because you dialed it down, didn't you? When are you back up at full speed now, John?
Not quite yet. We're I mean, it's a phased return. Corey's been back for a week and a bit. We had some lockdown episodes that we did on Emmerdale before that. We're still ramping up gradually, so bringing in more units. So at our peak, we probably have 4 units, and at the moment, I think we've got two or three, depending on what we're filming. So, the hope is that by the autumn, we'll be back up to transmitting 6 episodes. But obviously, we've got to build up a bit of a buffer to get to there.
And Claire, you mentioned you can box a bit clever insofar as you're taking money away from your international travel and you're investing it on screen in other areas. But is there any kind of leakage anywhere else across the production? I think you referenced editing earlier on this morning.
Editing's hard. We've got 3 flyaway edits working at the moment, and you know, people, you know, if schools aren't open and you've got, you know, a family with 2 young kids and both parents work, that's difficult. You've got to be mindful of that. And the one thing I would say is, I think that when people are working in isolation, and you'll see people on Zoom, is you can't read body language in the same way that you can when you're on a team in the office. You know, when we're all together, I am much more aware of somebody struggling a bit, and I think that's something to be really mindful of. And one of the things that is definitely taking longer, if you're setting up a big shoot that's involving a build like we're doing at the moment, if you're next to each other, or there's you and your researcher and your co-ord there, things are quicker because you're just over your shoulder. This time you've got to Zoom somebody, you've got, or they get. So broadcast centre has been closed but we can now access it again, and so that's really going to help. So I think what we're starting to do is the films 2 or 3 weeks before they go into production, we're going to socially distance it, being that team will be together. I think for people who live by themselves, it's really, really important that people can get back into a work situation as quickly as they can, because it's tough. It's been really tough for some of our younger members on Top Gear. You know, I've got my family here. It's okay. So the duty of care for us to the junior members who tend to be the younger ones, and just taking that time, and to say it's okay not to be okay, we've had to be really mindful of that. And I think that one person just said he felt more stressed, even though it wasn't a very stressful thing he was setting up. But then I said, that's because you're by yourself. You know, we're not with you. So things just everything takes longer, and the editing takes longer, and to just slightly lower your expectations of things, not the quality control, but things will just take longer to stay calm. I think that is really important.
Yeah, Sue, you're nodding there. I mean,
no, I would agree. I think we can associate with all of those issues. Yes, everything does take longer, and I think we've got all sorts of things to balance, and we're just really, apart from Sunday brunch, a lot of our things are just starting to gear up, and we've been looking at all of those productions individually, just to take each show and what it needs separately, and try to address those as best we can, with talking to the team members as well. You know, I think a lot of people are yes, desperate to get back, and of course that interaction is what production is built on, isn't it? It's really important for everybody's you know, well-being, I think, and for the programme. But interestingly, some people are still very nervous as well, and I think travel plays such a big part in that. I think people are very happy once they get to the office. They know that the office is going to be very well set up, and there'll be all sorts of protocols and measures in place. I think it's about people travelling on public transport. You know, we're in central London, and all of our offices are in city centres, so people will inevitably have to use public transport. That's the big question mark for us about working in the office and on productions as well. So yes, and in turn all of that does mean that we're spending more money. Are we looking at, you know, enabling people to travel by private transport to productions to make sure that they're comfortable? We're balancing that with being able to keep them in work, but making sure that they're safe in the process.
And with all of these things, whether it's extra time required or extra funding required, effectively, your duty is obviously to your staff. I fully appreciate that, but you've also got an obligation to your commissioners, right? In terms of managing up, and they've got certain pressures, and they are expecting show X to be delivered on day Y. So I guess, you know, is it just
but I think we have to work together. We have to discuss at the outset the implications of putting something into production, because we're all learning at the moment, and I think we're taking each production, as I say, separately. We're looking at what's the feasibility, how can we do this safely, and how can we put that foundation in place that we can then build on for other shows. And it's about probably taking small steps now, knowing that that will help us in the longer term to get things back up and running on a larger scale.
John, sorry, go ahead, Claire.
I've got to say that Kate Phillips we make Top Gear for Kate Phillips, and that's been it, just as Susan's been saying, it's completely collaborative. I can't say for sure when we'll be on air, because if there's a second spike, we're not going to be on air. We've got an on-air date that we're working to, but everybody is incredibly flexible. I mean, I've been in TV a while. I feel pretty supported, really pretty supported by everyone on this, because we're all in it together. And I think the collaboration between other shows that you're talking to, and everyone's a bit like saying, how did you do that about something? And we all know lots of people in the industry, and I think it's felt, I don't feel under pressure. I think that people, I mean, I don't know, if people suddenly start to say they really miss the foreign filming on Top Gear, there's nothing I can do about that. And there might be some of that, but we can only work with what we've got to work with.
And John, John McVeigh, would you echo that? I mean, what would your message be to broadcasters, or have you made any progress in terms of broadcasters understanding the pressure that their suppliers are under?
Well, we're having discussions, but also, I mean, all the broadcast.
Oh, is he gone?
Hello? Sorry, a call came in and it links to my iPad. Sorry. No, I mean, I think we all recognise the whole industry is under pressure. Commercial advertising's been hammered. The BBC's having to make efficiencies to its programme budget. I mean, getting back to work now is one thing. Going forward, when we're going to see budgets under a lot of pressure, and if this is an extended health and safety issue for production, then that will inevitably mean we have to have pretty grown-up discussions about what editorial ambitions are, what we can do in the circumstances. And I would echo Claire and Susan's comments was we've got to work with our commissioners to try and land that. We have a very creative, innovative industry, which I think is shown by the panelists here today, but you can only go so far. I mean, for a lot of smaller factual companies, margins are already below 3%. So where do you go? You have to have those grown-up discussions, and it'd be unreasonable to expect, we still want the same quality of the show, but you have to take on board COVID costs. And that means that you're virtually working for nothing, because that's not going to be good for crews. It's not going to be good for facilities, because it'll just put a downward pressure on the whole economy. So I think as an industry, we've got to find a way to sit down and deal with this in a mature and sensible way. And we've started those conversations already with senior people in the broadcasters, because we want to get as much work back as soon as possible. But we've also got to have an eye on next year as well as just this year. So.
And the other elephant in the room, when you talk about grown-up conversations, and it's come up a couple of times in the questions that I'm being sent through, is with regards to the insurance situation. Now, John, you've obviously been very vocal around the concern that producers are raising about whether they can be covered if a second spike occurs and lockdown does re-emerge. Can you give us an update in terms of any progress you're making with government, with broadcasters
Sure.
around the insurance issue?
Well, it's not just a producers issue. I've been leading a pan-industry working group on this since the beginning. And while everyone else was looking at health and safety protocols, my main focus was on insurance and explaining to government just why insurance is such a critical part of our business and why it's very different to most other businesses like retail or other sectors, which they understand quite well. How we use insurance to cover risk, but also by covering that risk, we also allow financing to happen. All of that's been quite a complicated process. But I mean, all the broadcasters own insurance policies all come to an end very shortly. So they won't be insured for COVID either. So this is a pan-industry problem. It affects everyone. And I'm currently leading a group which is in discussion with government to look at how we might try and get a temporary fix for that while government sorts out what is probably going to be called Pan-Ray, which is government underwriting of pandemic-related claims on insurance policies. So I wasn't much of an expert on production insurance a few weeks ago. I've become very familiar now. Some of the brokers and companies are now my best friends. But
I'm sure they're not, John.
No, they're not. No. Well, the brokers are different. The brokers are actually on the side of the producer, so because they're trying to get the claims paid just now. So, which are many, many hundreds of millions, I think, over the piece yet to be paid out. So. Watch this space. I mean, it's an active discussion we're having. We've got all the right people across the industry involved, and we're trying to get something that we can get to market relatively soon, so people can start planning going forward. I mean, there's many productions which can restart because they were already pre-insured, but even then, some of the insurers are now saying, well, we're not going to extend your insurance policy, so you won't be insured if you restart. So there's real problems. And of course, that will drag our recovery, and it will drag us getting back to even think about going into production and working safely, because no one will take the risk.
The panelists, to what extent was that an issue for you guys? I mean, it's something we're hearing anecdotally quite a lot. It's coming up in the questions. Did you guys just have to cross your fingers and hope for the best? And or Sue, you're nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, we are really. I think that's really what it boils down to. But that's why I, what I mean really about us looking carefully at what it is we are putting back into production and how we're doing it, and it only strengthens all of the measures that we're putting in place. You know, there will be things that just are not worth taking the risk on. None of it is completely controllable, we know that. But yeah, at the moment, we know people are working to try and come up with something that is going to give us a bit more reassurance. But until it's there, we've all just got to tread really, really carefully, I think.
John McVeigh, you were going to say something, no?
Yeah, I mean, we do know. I mean, Sue and others are probably, and I know of many other indies who are doing production, but it's in a very limited and controlled way, where it's very controllable and you can manage the risks very, very carefully. That's fine, and that's great, and it's also given learning and building confidence with crew and talent and production personnel. That's all great. The big problem is if we have another lockdown. That's the big problem. I mean, there were in excess of 500 claims went in from the UK production sector when the lockdown was introduced. So what we're trying to do is get something that would allow us to get back to work and cover us if there was a production lockdown, a regional lockdown, or a national lockdown. There'd be some way to give us the confidence, and because it's about talent as well. I think John's point about explaining to cast and crew, the health and safety isn't a paper exercise, it's a people exercise. Well, so is insurance. You know, if you're going to hire talent, they're going to say, well, what happens if there's a lockdown?
Yeah, I mean,
are we going to get paid?
Yeah, John Weston, go ahead.
Yeah, it's slightly different on the soaps because obviously we to some extent self-insure, unlike a high-end drama where you've got your scripts, you've got your 2 or 3 bits of key talent. If one of those goes down, then the production goes down. We can be a little bit more agile by if somebody's self-isolated for a bit, as we were doing before lockdown. We were in that sort of frantic month before when we were just trying to get everything filmed, and we were finding people were self-isolating because their kid had a cough or something. We just have to adapt our stories around that, and the writers were brilliant at writing around that. But insurance is a big problem for the big high-end dramas.
One thing I was interested, John Weston, is that you mentioned the fact that you'd be making shows with fewer off-screen talent, if I understood you correctly. Is there a sense that you'll be working with fewer staff, smaller crews in future?
Yeah, well, I think what we're finding is that working in the way that we're working, it's incredibly intense for the people who are on the floor. The days are because you're trying to do 2 things at once. One is your job, and the other is have antennae around you to keep yourself and everybody else around you safe. So I think for the soaps, it means that we'll probably rotate people more into those roles, rather than that we suddenly, hey, we used to have 30 people on a filming unit. Now we're doing it with 15. We don't need that other 15. We absolutely need that other 15. And also, I think the hope is, as we sort of start to loosen up a bit, maybe in the autumn a bit, we can start to bring some of those things back in. We can do our fancy dolly shots that I then cut out in the edit. We can do all that kind of stuff, and we want to do it, because it's lovely to have a bit of richness, and people expect it from the soap genre. We blow things up, and when we do it, we spend $1.5 million on blowing things up. It's comparable to what high-end drama does, and people have come to expect it from soap. So we'll get back to that, but not for a while.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I've just been asked to make clear that some of the questions I've been feeding in are actually questions from the audience. So please don't think you guys are being ignored. And I'm not referencing any names specifically. I am including your questions. So I just want the panelists and the audience at home to be aware of that. Susan, one thing I wanted to ask you about, you referenced, thinking laterally and having to make some moves regards space and studios. Do you anticipate any cost inflation? As everyone re-enters production, is there going to be a squeeze on space, on talent, on crew? What's your thoughts around a potential bottleneck?
Well, the bottleneck that I think existed anyway, was probably just being added to, is studio space across the UK generally. So yes, there's a potential there that studio availability is going to be under huge pressure. I mean, we already can see that. There are pencils on space 5 layers deep, in lots of instances. Yes, there are. Whether it pushes up costs, I think our experience so far is that people are all trying to be reasonable and not push up costs just for the sake of it. It's in everybody's interest to get production moving. So yes, people are so far, probably because they can, because not everybody is banging the door down for space and resources. At the moment, I hope people will find a way to work it out. Time will tell. But yeah, the freelance team are, I think they shouldn't be pushing their rates up. I don't imagine they will. I think they'll be glad to get back into work.
I've got a question come in about food and drinks for cast and crew. Claire, I think we touched on this earlier this morning. What's the situation regards people bringing in consumables?
Well, it is probably the safest if you bring your own in, bring your own packed lunch and everything. Most of the hotels don't have anywhere communal to eat anymore if you're on location. Bring your own flask, name it. Bring your own water bottle, name it. We do have a catering van, because we're quite often away for 3 days. But it takes a bit of planning. Our shoots are quite big, so there's like 35 of us. We used to put like snack packs in the camera cars. Don't do that anymore. We have one of our runners has a snack van, and only she has access to that, because you've got to nobody can go and help themselves to stuff anymore. So,
he's got the power.
She.
I said she.
But so yes, catering trucks is probably the easiest thing, or drive-throughs. That's what we're doing, because none of the hotels, there is sometimes room service, but not all of them. So you need to be really ahead of that. But packed lunch is a good way to get through the lunch bit, and it's quick. Yeah,
efficiencies. We've had a question in about freelancers. I know we've just touched on staffing then, and John Weston addressed it. I don't know, Claire or Susan or John for that matter, if you want to talk about what your sense is about what the implications of the situation may mean for freelancers. There's been a lot of concerns about individuals leaving the industry as work opportunities dry up. Is your sense that your need for freelance labour will continue at the levels that it always was, or is there going to be pressure there? Susan or Claire, maybe, do you want to address that?
I think for the moment we're not planning to contract fewer freelancers. No, it totally dependent on the productions that are able to go into production. So no, I don't think so. I think we will be working really, really hard to make sure that we are able to employ people as much as we were. at level market rates, I think, you know, is the expectation.
And I think for us that, I mean, obviously the days of having a production that's staffed by people on staff, that doesn't exist anymore. So we've got quite a few people on fixed term contracts, but our directors are all freelance or service company. And, you know, we need those to be done. We don't have a staff, we just wouldn't have that. So as long as we're making Top Gear, we will keep using freelancers. But I think the difficulty is the, you know, things like some of our directors make car ads. Well, the bottom's fallen through that market at the moment. So it's really tough. It's really tough because we can supply work, but there's just not the same amount of work out there.
Fine. Okay. I think I've reached the end of the questions. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I hope everyone has enjoyed the panel and found it useful. Please join me in extending my thanks to Claire and Sue and both Johns. And yes, thank you to the RTS for hosting this event. And I hope to speak to you all guys again soon. Very best of luck with your shows.